Hello everyone. In this class, we'll learn about the principles of hemodynamics. The objectives of this class would be to understand the basic physical principles governing circulation of blood, apply the knowledge of hemodynamics in understanding cardiovascular functions, appreciate the velocity flow pressure relationship of blood vessels, and list the differences between laminar and turbulent flow. Understand the factors governing peripheral resistance. Understand the application of law of Laplace in determining various cardiovascular functions. Hemodynamics is the interaction of various physical principles that govern circulation of the blood. Cardiovascular system is a complex system of heart and blood vessels. The heart is the mechanical pump which continuously pumps the blood into circulation that creates the pressure needed for forward movement of blood in the vessels. Blood vessels transport blood between the heart and the tissues. Blood vessels in different parts of the circulatory system have different dimensions, thickness, and elasticity that greatly influence the flow of blood. Blood flow is also influenced by composition and rheological properties of blood. Thus, blood circulation is influenced by many physiochemical factors. Nevertheless, the blood flow is primarily depends on two important factors, that is the properties of blood and the diameter of the blood vessels. Blood vessels are always under influence of various neural and humoral factors, and vessel diameter is the outcome of the integrated effect of these two factors on blood vessels. Blood is not a simple liquid, rather a suspension of cells and fats that are dispersed in the colloidal solution of proteins. In spite of the complexity of the blood as a fluid and susceptibility of vessels for abrupt change in their diameter, the circulation of the blood occurs harmoniously due to the operation of various principles of hemodynamics. Therefore, before studying the physiology of circulation, it is essential to learn the basics of hemodynamics. Physical principles governing circulation: the velocity, flow, pressure relationship. The relation between velocity and the blood flow. Velocity is defined as the rate of displacement of fluid with respect to the time, which is expressed as a distance per unit time, that is centimeters per second. Flow is defined as the volume of displacement per unit time. The velocity of the fluid in a system depends on an area and flow. The flow in turn depends on the pressure gradient, properties of the fluid, and dimensions of the hydraulic system of the tube. Velocity is the flow divided by the area of the conduit. So here V is equal to Q by A, where is the velocity and Q is the flow and A is the area. Effect of cross-sectional area. The average velocity of the fluid movement in a system is directly proportional to the flow and inversely proportional to the total cross-sectional area of the system. Velocity gradually decreases as the blood flow from the aorta through arteries and arterioles into capillaries due to progressive increase in the cross-sectional area. Velocity slowly increases as blood passes from venules through veins into vena cava, which occurs due to the gradual decrease in the cross-sectional area of these vessels as they approach to the heart. So this diagram showing the cross-sectional area and the blood flow velocity. So as the cross-sectional area decreases, the velocity will be high. As the cross-sectional area increases, the blood velocity is going to decrease. In the capillaries, the velocity will be very low and cross-sectional is very high. The velocity versus pressure. The change in the pressure in hydraulic system changes the velocity of the fluid movement. The pressure in a hydraulic system has two components, the lateral pressure component and the dynamic pressure component. Lateral pressure is the side pressure that is exerted constantly on the wall of the tube, and dynamic pressure is the component of pressure which is affected by the kinetic energy of flow. Bernoulli's principle states that the total pressure, that is, the static plus dynamic pressure in a closed system, remains always constant. Change in the dynamic pressure component that occurs frequently in hydraulic system changes the lateral pressure. In circulatory system, at the sites of narrowing of the blood vessels, the velocity of flow increases, which in turn increases the dynamic component of the pressure. The pressure in the dynamic the increase in the dynamic pressure decreases the lateral pressure. Lateral pressure in the blood vessel determines the degree of perfusion of the tissues as it decides the amount of blood that enters into the branches from the main vessel. Thus, at the site of constriction, the perfusion of the tissue decreases. Therefore, myocardial infarction is common in aortic stenosis. So this diagram shows the Bernoulli's effect. At the area of the constriction, the lateral pressure is going to decrease compared to the dilated vessels, and the blood flow to the tissue here is affected or compromised. Then flow, pressure and resistance relations. Increase in the pressure increases the flow, and decreased pressure decreases the flow. So Ohm's law, the relationship between flow, pressure and resistance in a hydraulic system is well compared with the relationship between current, electromotive force and resistance in an electrical circuit. So where Ohm's law states that current, that is I, is equal to the E divided by R, that is electromotive force divided by resistance. Similarly, in flow pressure resistance relationship, flow is equal to pressure divided by resistance. In vascular system, pressure is the effective perfusion pressure, that is the mean interluminal pressure at the arterial end minus the mean pressure at the venous end, and the resistance is the peripheral resistance. Flow is directly proportional to the pressure and inversely proportional to the resistance. Increase in resistance decreases the flow. There are different types of blood flow: the laminar blood flow and the turbulent blood flow. Laminar blood flow. Normally the flow of the blood in the vessel is laminar in nature. That means it is in layers. Laminar flow is also called as streamline flow. The layer of the blood which is in close contact with the wall of the vessel does not move at all due to the frictional resistance with the vessel wall. The velocity slowly increases towards the center of the vessel. However, laminar flow occurs up to a certain velocity beyond which the flow becomes turbulent. The velocity above which the flow is turbulent is known as critical velocity. Turbulent flow. The turbulent flow occurs when velocity is above critical velocity. The turbulence of flow depends on the diameter of the vessel and the viscosity of the blood. The probability of turbulence is expressed in terms of Reynolds number, which is calculated as Reynolds number is equal to nu dV divided by mu, where Re is a Reynolds number, nu is the density of the fluid, d is the diameter of the tube, v is the velocity of flow, and mu is the viscosity of the fluid. The Reynolds number less than 200, the flow is laminar, and when Reynolds number is more than 3000, the flow is turbulent. In cardiovascular system, at the site of constriction, increase in the velocity of the blood flow makes the flow turbulent. The turbulence of the flow produces sound, therefore a murmurish sound is heard on auscultation at the site of constriction of the vessel or cardiac orifice. So this diagram showing the laminar flow, you can see the different layers of the blood which is flowing, and at the periphery the velocity is 0, and in the center the velocity is highest. And when the turbulent flow occurs when the laminar flow is disorganized because of the increase in the velocity, which is going to produce turbulence. So this is the difference between the laminar and turbulent blood flow. The flow occurs in layers or in streamline in laminar, but there won't be any layers in the turbulent flow. The velocity will be below the critical velocity, where during turbulent flow the velocity will be more than the critical velocity. Reynolds number is below 2000, here it is more than 3000. The laminar flow does not produce sound, whereas this produces the sound. Coming to the Poiseuille-Hagen formula. Poiseuille-Hagen formula denotes the relationship between viscosity of the fluid with the radius and length of the tube. So Poiseuille-Hagen formula is given as F, that is flow, is equal to pressure difference between the two ends of the tube into pi by 8 into 1 by mu into r to the power of 4 divided by the L, where mu is viscosity of the fluid, r is radius, the L is length of the tube. Flow is equal to the pressure difference divided by the resistance. Therefore, resistance is R is equal to 8 nu L divided by pi r to the power of 4. Flow varies directly with the fourth power of the radius. Therefore, vessel diameter is most important factor in determining the blood flow and the pressure. Effect of the vessel diameter. The flow becomes double in a vessel just by increasing the radius about 20%. The flow affects the pressure, thus the change in the diameter changes the flow and pressure. In fact, the blood pressure is markedly increased by vasoconstriction and decreased by vasodilatation. On the contrary, resistance is inversely proportional to the radius. Peripheral resistance. Resistance offered to the flow of blood in the peripheral circulation is peripheral resistance. Some of the factors affecting peripheral resistance are radius of the blood vessel. The radius of the blood vessel affects peripheral resistance. This is called as vascular hindrance. Vasoconstriction increases and vasodilatation decreases peripheral resistance. Decrease in radius of vessels to half increases peripheral resistance by 16 times. When radius is doubled, resistance is reduced to 6% of its previous value. Another factor is viscosity of blood. Viscosity of blood also affects peripheral resistance. This is called hematological hindrance. Viscosity mainly depends on the factors like hematocrit, composition of the plasma, resistance of the red cells to deformation, and temperature. Depends on hematocrit. Hematocrit is packed cell volume, which depends mainly on the number of red cells in the blood. Increase in the hematocrit increases the viscosity. The effect of change in the viscosity on resistance is less in smaller vessels than larger vessels due to the difference in nature of flow through the small vessels. Viscosity increases in polycythemia and decreases in anemia. In anemia, circulation is hyperdynamic due to decreased peripheral resistance. So this diagram shows the the relation between hematocrit and the viscosity. As the hematocrit increases, the viscosity is also going to increase. Then depends on the composition of the plasma. In plasma, it is mainly the concentration of plasma proteins that affects the viscosity. Viscosity increases in conditions like in which the concentration of the plasma protein is more. For example, paraproteinemia and multiple myeloma. Viscosity decreases in hypoproteinemia. Then it depends on the resistance of the red cells to deformation. When the red cells become rigid, as seen in hereditary spherocytosis, viscosity increases. Then temperature, increase in the body temperature decreases the viscosity, and decrease in the temperature increases the viscosity. Plasma skimming. In blood vessels, cells mostly accumulate at the center. Therefore, the portion of blood which is available at the periphery of the blood vessel has a low cell content. Blood entering into the smaller branches arising from large vessels mainly comes from the peripheral part of the column of the blood. Thus, smaller branches receive blood containing less red cells, and this phenomenon is called as plasma skimming. This explains why hematocrit of capillary blood is about 25% less than the whole body hematocrit. So when the artery branches into the smaller branches, obviously in the smaller branch the number of RBCs are less, the plasma is high, so hematocrit is less, whereas the larger branches they will have a more RBCs, less plasma, and increase in the hematocrit values. Critical closing pressure. Flow ceases when pressure is reduced beyond a point, but not at zero. But pressure is not zero here. The pressure at which the flow stops is called as critical closing pressure. This is explained by two factors. One is some pressure is required to force the red cells to pass through the capillaries, which have the smaller diameter than the red cells. And second one is the blood vessels are surrounded by the tissues that exert the pressure, that is the tissue pressure on them. Thus, intralaminar pressure in the capillary should be more than the tissue pressure for the flow to resume. So this is a diagram showing the critical closing pressure. So when pressure decreases at a critical point but not zero, the flow ceases in the circulation. The law of Laplace. This law explains the relationship between the distending pressure tension in the wall of the structure and the radius. So pressure can be given as T into 1 by R1 and 1 plus 1 by R2, where R1 and R2 are its two principal radii of curvature. In sphere, R1 is equal to R2, so the formula becomes P is equal to 2T divided by R. In a cylindrical structure such as a thin-walled blood vessel, the curvature occurs in only one dimension, and the other radius is infinite. So here P becomes T by R, or the tension becomes pressure into radius. So in small diameter vessel, the less wall tension is required to balance the distending pressure. So this protects the small vessels from rupture. If the thickness of the wall is taken into consideration, then in an artery, the wall tension will be equal to the pressure into radius divided by the thickness of the vessel wall. Application of the Laplace law. In hollow viscous, the wall tension depends on the distending pressure and its radius. That means the wall tension increases when the organ gets filled or the cavity size increases. Also, the wall tension decreases when wall thickness is more, and the wall tension increases when the wall thickness decreases. So in ventricular hypertrophy, as the wall is thick, the wall tension is less. On the other hand, in dilated heart, as it is seen in heart failure, more energy is required to pump the blood as the wall tension is more. That is, ventricular wall is not thick in dilated heart. Therefore, dilated or distended heart pumps blood less efficiently. So this diagram shows the effect, the relation between the pressure, radius, and the tension. Okay, so as the pressure and the radius is going to increase, the tension in the vessel wall is going to increase. So this is regarding in brief about the hemodynamics. Thank you.